Hello, everybody.
Hello, everybody.
We got Mutt and Jeff back at you. Tim, this is our 100th episode. You know what?
Have we got a show for you?
Oh, you sound like the Veggie Tales.
What?
Remember in the Veggie Tales, there's like, that's when they start. Do you like to do something? And they're like, then we have a show for you. That's us. We have a show. I used to have. There he is. 100th episode. We were kind of in lamentation over the fact that we don't have any grand thing, but I will tell you this. Let me see if I can get a close up. But we have new hats in. If you can, everything's backwards on camera. We got some new hats in. I'll give it about a week, and maybe on next week's show, everybody that comments on today's show, today's broadcast, on Facebook, YouTube, or whatever, if you make a comment with your name or whatever, I'll put you into a drawing, and whoever wins will get a free hat. How's that sound? That's a terrible 100th episode gift, but that's what we have.
You're going to put their name into a drawing to win a free hat, or everybody that comments gets a free hat?
Well, I don't have that many hats.
Oh, okay. Well,
I've already, these are so popular. I've already sold several out of this last bunch. But because with your popularity, that could be expensive if we did it that way. Anyway, but honestly, as always, we do hope that you would comment, let us know you're out there. We're going to be doing something that Tim and I do all the time, but today we're going to do it with you. We're working through kind of some material. We've mentioned it before that we've talked about actually writing a book together. But it's stuff we talk about on the podcast all the time, and part of it, I know Tim and I talk about this a lot, is sometimes we're like, man, it just always seems that we come back to the same places, no matter what text we're in. Some of that is the way we think and just how we're bent, but a lot of it is just because that's how the scriptures do. I mean, I heard a guy say the other day on a podcast that his view of the Old Testament is that it's all about pointing us to who God is. Not so much, it is history, but that its purpose in being there was to show us the nature, the character of God, and let us learn who he is, to get more applicable as we get into the New Testament. Jesus changes things, starts putting some feet on it and fulfilling it. I thought that was fair.
I wouldn't argue that point, but I would say the New Testament does the same thing.
Well, it does, and that was kind of my point, was that it does do that. But we're always talking about what it looks like to walk with the Lord. I did some teaching this week over at Cross Brand, and I was in my studies, I was realizing that there's a lot of, like, we use language, in the church, we use language, we use assumptions, and we kind of think everybody's on the same page. I was teaching Wednesday night on being submitted to governments and stuff.
Yeah.
And in my studies, in preparation for that, I realized that we had to do some definitions. When I was in debate, that was the first thing you did. You present your thesis or whatever, or your proposition. Then you had to define what the words of that meant to make sure everybody was on the same page. And that Wednesday night, I had to define what submission meant, because just to make sure we all understood, we're not talking about some ethereal whatever. He's really talking about being in subordination to something in that passage. And so we use phrases like seeking God's face. We see, living in God's face, staring in God. And so we want to start talking about what it looks like, as we use phrases to walk with the Lord. And Tim,
well, not just walk with the Lord. We talk about those things, and if you've been around, walk with the Lord. Okay, well, read the scriptures. In the Spirit, I feel like he's with me, or I have things like that. Those are still kind of ethereal functions or specific things you can do to try to get you to do that. What's it like to walk with the Lord? I mean, in a literal sense, in this life, and can you even do it?
Right.
And those are legitimate questions. I mean, some people may be sitting up on the edge of their chair going, "Oh, of course you can do it." Because if you're like what you just talked about, you have all this terminology, you got all this church history, you got all this stuff. Whatever terms and however you've defined that, you start thinking that's what it is to walk with the Lord. And I'm not arguing whether it is or it isn't.
Well, the question that Tim started out, we weren't talking about today's show, but we thought it was a good kind of a turn, was why is it that human beings are so bent on finding that formula, finding that method to categorizing God, to categorizing his worship? Why are we so bent on doing that instead of just learning who he is? Why do you think that we're so bent to doing that?
Well, but I think it goes deeper than that. When you start looking at, well, I'm crazy, so I need to go talk to a psychiatrist or a psychologist or something like that. Or if things are not right, I need to go see what I can do. We just assume that those people, that sounds bad, that people like that have an intellectual level that's higher than ours. They see things better, they can articulate things better, and they can help put us, make us understand where we're at. And that's true. But if you look at all the professions of some intellectual scale, psychologists, doctors, lawyers, anything like that has to have some kind of a higher intellect, so to speak, or that we perceive have a higher intellect, so to speak, even philosophers and all that kind of stuff. Probably since the late 1700s, early 1800s, as philosophers and stuff began to happen in time like that, they all used to reference from a moral perspective Jesus or God or the kingdom at some level, even if they didn't really agree with it. And people would say, oh, well, that's because it was more in the society and they talked about that and used it as reference. And that's probably true to a certain degree. But you look at it now, even Christians, they never bring up the kingdom or Jesus or how that perspective difference is. It's all on a much higher plane, so to speak, that it's something and not that. So it's almost, what I'm getting at is nobody really, well, that was a bad way to say it. They don't believe that God is who we think he is or who we would want him to be. And so we begin to really use our own intellect and wisdom to try to solve and do and be things. And what I'm talking about walking with God, I'm talking about like when Adam and Eve were in the garden. Everybody thinks that was like a 5-minute thing and they screwed it up. I have no idea how much time was involved in that, but there had to be a fair amount.
Yeah.
And I'm convinced that on their daily, whatever it was they were doing, working in the garden, hanging out, looking at the sun, whatever it was, they weren't thinking of God all the time, every time and all that, because he was just part of them and part of what was going on. And in their own actions, they didn't violate things that God told them not to do, not out of some head-button thing or something like that, but just out of it's the same thing when your kid's going nuts and mom and dad say stop and they stop. Okay.
It's just the way it is.
In a good way.
Yeah. Yeah.
A purposeful way, how it's supposed to be, if you want to use that term.
Well, and it's like, I mean, maybe even a more simplistic term, when you're not talking about doing wrong or whatever, is like, my wife's coming in the door and she's got her hands full with a bunch of stuff. She's like, hey, can you help me a second? Sure. You grab a few things and there's not I'm not helping you, self-sufficient.
You brought them in, you do it yourself.
Yeah, there's it's so natural because it's just a natural movement of humanity. It's a natural movement of relationship.
Well, and I think that was put together by God on purpose.
I totally agree.
And but we come to a conclusion where we think you may not even be trying to think that way. but then you begin to think that it is me. It's on me. I can do as I please
Right.
and as I want, and I don't have to answer to anybody for that.
Right.
That is but in your inner self somewhere, you know that there's bigger and other things.
Well, and I think
And it's not mystical.
one of the things I think that we were talking about, we forget, is that part of the redemption that Christ brought was to take us back to the status of the way things were in the garden. And we get literally 2.5 chapters of everything's awesome. And then the whole rest of the scriptures are him putting it back together. And
Yeah.
if you study Genesis 1, Genesis 2, even in just the creation story, but just that little portion that we don't get a whole lot of what it looked like to be Adam, Eve, walking in the cool of the day with the Lord before the fall. We just don't get much of that before they screw it up. But I like the way Tim characterizes that walking with the Lord in deep intimacy was just so natural.
It's natural.
And we are wired that way, broken as we are, we're wired
Yeah.
that way. You know, the psychologists or even Christian psychologists will talk about there's a God-sized hole in everybody.
Yeah.
Whatever, that kind of stuff. But it's really, there's a lot of truth in that. But what that is referencing is this way that we're built to walk with God. We're built to worship and walk with the Lord.
And I'll even go it a little further. This is where people think that I got a foil hat on. He built us individually to deal with him individually.
Yeah.
Well, what I mean by that is we got to look to each other to figure all that out. We don't have to look to each other to figure all that out. Now, he has built an element of that.
Yeah.
I agree with that. I'm not saying you got to be completely separate in that. But when this element starts having difficulty, you go back to him in your face and all that stuff, and he works all those kinds of things out because he is the originator of us. He is the one that built that, and he made it so. It's a whole nother story, but the Tower of Babel story that everybody's relatively familiar with, those people were about to achieve something that wasn't like going to change the world or anything like that from a eternal perspective. But for those people specifically, if they had achieved that, what that means was they would have shut God off, and they wouldn't even have known why they have done it. And so it was an act of redemption of sorts that he went in and confounded all that to make them look towards him again.
Right. Well, and that's what I was talking with somebody the other day about hardship and suffering and even division and unity. You know, you go to John 17, we talk about God always desires unity, which means he never wants there to be division. Well, that's not true.
Yeah, that's not true.
It's not true. Paul would even write that I understand there are divisions among you, and there must be, so that those who are true and real in their faith can, and I'm paraphrasing, can be made known. Babel was about division because the unity that Babel brought was not centered around Christ, or it's in the Old Testament, but centered around God, wasn't centered around the kingdom, wasn't centered around eternity. It was centered around human achievement.
Yeah, they were built to be able to achieve,
and they weren't
but they
achieving.
quit looking at what built them to achieve it.
And I like in that story because it says that one of the reasons he says in himself of the Godhead, we did this because if they were able to finish it, there's nothing that they can't do.
Yeah.
You know, and if they continue, because of the fact that we were made in his image, even broken, our capacity is far above what we consider it to be.
Yeah.
And I don't just mean like, you know, we're all Marvel superheroes. I don't mean that. I mean our capacity to understand, our capacity to believe, to have faith, to do. And Jesus tried to tell the apostles and the disciples this all the time. You could say to this mountain, move, and it'll move. You don't even understand the
And I think those were literal statements.
Yeah, and that's how they were able to go out and raise the dead and heal the sick and blind people. With, you know, and he's like, you don't understand. You're made in my image. But the problem we get into is we start looking for the scientific formula that brings us into the Imago Dei.
Well, but we're also looking to, if we have that, then we know that we're there.
If we have what?
If I can move the mountain, I know that I am in right with God.
Well, that's what we think.
And so you focus on, what do I got to do to move the mountain? And you've missed the whole point again.
Yeah.
If you could really actually move the mountain because of your relation and understanding of the kingdom, you wouldn't really think about wanting to move the mountain.
Well, you know, and we had a conversation yesterday. For 16 years ago, when Brennan was born, I had no idea how much kingdom truth I was going to learn from this little disabled child. But yesterday morning, we had a meeting with a new doctor, a palliative care doctor. And palliative care is kind of a step between what they would call curative, let's get this thing beaten over with, and like hospice care, where you're talking about being comfortable. Palliative care is this, especially for pediatrics, is in the middle of, hey, look, there's some conditions here that we're not going to beat. Okay? If she has a sinus infection, we can beat that. You give antibiotics, you give this, you give that, you get over it. Well, in chronically ill, especially children, they're not getting over these things. All you can really do is manage symptoms and try to give better quality of life. And so palliative care is a different approach. You step back and you think, okay, you start analyzing, why are we doing this? Well, do we have to do that?
Right.
Do we have to do this? You know, you start, wherever there's a pain point, and I say all that to say it's just a different mindset. It's stepping back, because regular medicine says, what's our goal? Our goal is to be well. So what are the steps that we have to take to be well?
Yeah.
We do the same thing with our walk with the Lord.
Yeah.
The end goal is to be with the Lord, to know God, and to show His power. That's what we think, okay? The end goal is to know Him and to be known by Him. But like you said, we think that, oh, well, we'll know we have His power and that we're in His graces if we can move the mountain, so we focus on the mountain, moving it. Well, in the medicine world, they get so focused on curing, the disease that's never going to get better. They lose sight of the fact of the damage they're doing or the suffering they're creating in the process. Well, I was just kind of contemplating that today, and I'm like, and then you said that, and it really just kind of all comes back together. It's like, that's what we do. We associate some sort of a arbitrary end goal, Bible study, move the mountain, go to church, fill in the blank of whatever we do. And we know if we're doing that thing, then we're in with God. And the whole time, all He's asking us to do is to know Him and be known by Him.
So all this conversation that we're having, because as I walk and I look and I go to these places and I deal with all the stuff that I've done, it's that question of what is real. And so all this ethereal sounding stuff that we're talking about here, what we want to do is go into the scriptures, because again, first off, you got to believe this is real, and you got to believe all the stories that are in it are not just stories, they're real. Right. Because if that's not there, then we're wasting our time, and you're wasting your time listening to this. And so what we want to do is go in, and for me anyway, in my walk, I guess I'll look comparatively. I don't know if that's the right word. So there's some teaching and sermon stuff that I've done over Elijah and his servant, that it calls it in the King James, and his name is Gehazi or Gehazi, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And there's an episode in there where everybody and their dog is after Elisha, because when the enemy's going after Judah, he goes over and tells the king of Judah, hey, the enemy's going to do this. And they always get routed.
Yep.
Well, they found out that that's what was going on. So that in all of itself, that seems like something out of the Lord of the Rings or something, right? Those kings knew that Elisha was the one that understood, that knew what was happening. They didn't really get into discussions about why he did, but they knew that he did.
Right.
And they knew about the God of the Israelites
And they feared
how
him.
they put it together or how they wanted to think about it. See, these are the things you got to see in those stories, right?
Yeah.
And so what I'm getting to is that one day they found Elisha, and at this little community called Dothan, and the enemy came in and literally surrounded this place. And it's not like being in your house and it was surrounded by 50 people. He was in a place, and he was surrounded by hundreds upon hundreds of
maybe
people.
thousands upon
so
thousands.
this was a huge ring that was covering some real estate, all coming after this one guy.
Yep.
And the story is Gehazi wakes up in the morning, early one morning, and he, stretching, and he goes and looks out the window, and he's like, ah. And I don't know, maybe in his life he's thinking, oh, well, I'm with Elisha here, so everything's good. It's kind of like the apostles, or before they were apostles, and they were running around with Jesus, and Jesus is giving some sermon somewhere, and I can just see them standing there where they're going, yeah, right, what he said, and we're with him. And then later on you see him go, what did you mean when you said that? So I think it's that precarious little situation, right? And that's like us in our walk. We want to know God. We want to know all these things. We want to be in line with that and be able to tell others, yes, this is how it works and this is what he's doing, and be right all the time about it, because then we know that we're in. That's how we feel. Well, Elisha or Gehazi looks out the window and he sees this, and he, from a human perspective, on our plane of how we see things, he knew it was over. There was no way they could get away from this.
Yeah.
And he wakes up his master in a huge panic. And I kind of feel some of this in, but Elisha walks up and he looks out the window, and he starts praying, and he says, Lord, open his eyes. Now, he'd been walking with Elisha for a long time. And Gehazi looks out and he sees an army that's around that army, and it ain't just an army. It's flaming chariots and soldiers.
Yeah.
Real men with swords that 15 people couldn't pick up, kind of stuff. Anyway, a whole nother trail takes off after this, but I'm looking at Gehazi here. He's like us. And Elisha, and we would, we read the history of Elisha, and we would expect Elisha, we would expect to see something like that just from reading through the book, right?
Right.
But don't miss the fact that Elisha was a guy, it didn't matter how powerful he was or how he got to where he was, he lived his life looking at the kingdom all the time.
Mm-hmm.
That was not a snapshot that he saw. I think he saw it everywhere he walked, and he did, and it was completely natural to him.
Well, it's almost like too, that I kind of almost get the feel that he kind of forgets in that passage that Gehazi can't see it.
Yeah, because it's so natural.
Yeah, it's just the way things are. And one of the goals to me of learning to walk with the Lord, listening to the Holy Spirit and those things, is for the integration of the kingdom realm and what we would consider the earthly realm. Some people will say the spiritual and the natural.
Yeah, we have all these terms to break them in two, but they're
not two things.
Yeah,
they're. It's not that we're trying to seek to weave them together through. They're already woven together, and Elisha and these guys in the Old Testament, especially, there's some really good broad stroke pictures painted for us. They understood that. Did they always understand it to its fullest? No. Did they always walk in it? Some of these characters they did, and then they didn't.
Yeah, that's common all the way through.
Look, it was what was his name? The king who had to go crawl around like an animal for 7 years. Nebuchadnezzar.
Nebuchadnezzar, yeah.
King Nebi, and he went from this place of understanding and knowing, and he went into some rebellion, had all that stuff. But in that story, it talks about when he came to his senses, and the Lord brought him back to his right mind. When he once again had his right mind, it was like he remembered all of those sorts of things. It's part of who we are. And when we come to know Christ and we start walking with him, and we have something that even they didn't have as a whole, and that is the ubiquitous indwelling of the Holy Spirit
Yeah.
to teach us and to walk with us and to empower us and to help us to learn what this looks like. I think that some of the propensity that we have to seek the formula and to figure out the way to move the mountain so that we know we're in is because we're afraid to really look in his face and to know him.
Well, and I would agree with that. And that's because in some semblance, we are a long way off. We feel like we're a long way off, and we can never achieve that. But then Moses in Deuteronomy tells everybody that he's not that far off. He's in your mind and in your heart.
Yeah.
And then Paul repeats that in Romans chapter 10. And so you can't miss those things. And so I'm not just talking about this wondrous story of Elisha. In the New Testament, I think that Paul and Peter and John and James and those guys, they walked like that too.
Eventually.
Not always. And they went back and forth. Well, right. But my point is they had a better reference of reality, not because of who they were, but because not only they believed, but they pursued it.
Well, and have you ever noticed in the Gospels when he's calling his disciples, I've something that's always stuck out to me. Either we don't see and they just didn't record all of the story of him calling them. Here's what we get. Jesus says, "Come follow me." They say, "Okay," and they left their nets and followed him. That's what we get. We don't get this great, hey, one of these days when you're not busy, or we don't get the times that he came and talked to them before. I don't know how much of that there was. What we get for our edification, the part that the Holy Spirit said, this is what future generations of believers need to know is, Jesus said, "Come follow me," and they went. Okay?
Yeah.
I'll use an example of what I think happened there. Don't let me forget to come back to the disciples. Many, many, many times I come around people in the church. I know they're believers, and I don't mean like in particular church. I just mean in the body of Christ.
Yeah.
I know they're believers, and I can tell they're believers. They profess it, and there's a camaraderie there at some level. Give it or take it or leave it. Good people, blah, blah, blah. But then sometimes I come in contact with people and something's just different about them. And it's like not just camaraderie, it's like an instantaneous knitting together of soul. It's like, I don't even really have good words for it. There's a communion that I can't explain. It's intangible. And the scriptures will talk about the Spirit bearing witness with our spirit. And that's how I explain it. It's like there's a supernatural connection. And it's happened over and over and over again. As I get to know these people that happens with, what I find out is that they have been digging deep into the face of God, knowing who he is and learning to walk with him and listen to his Spirit. And something's different about them than the people who are good people, but that are just pursuing the churchy thing. And it's not about church being bad or anything like that.
Yeah.
Let me put a different word in to put some of your minds at ease. We're not against the church. It's people who are pursuing moving the mountain, and then the people that are pursuing the mountain mover have a different interaction.
And that, boy, you said it right there. We if you want to know what to do, you always look at things to pursue the mountain mover. Even like reading the Beatitudes. There's people a lot smarter than I have just written just volumes and volumes and volumes about that. But in the end, we read that on our simplistic selves. How do I be these things? How do I do these things? Because that makes us kingdomly. When you really need to be looking at it like, why would Jesus even talk those things to explain what's going on in the kingdom? Because after that, he starts talking about the kingdom is like.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, anyway, I think that these guys like Elisha or Job or Paul or any of these people, at whatever they decided to follow and they believed and they wrestled with their old selves to put away the old selves, And if there's something standing before you where you're not looking at God for who he is and learning what he is, that's the discipline of putting away that so that it doesn't disrupt your view. That doesn't mean you have it all. It means you're pursuing that.
Well,
And that's what he wants. And that's what I see in Elisha and Paul. And I mean, Job, I can't get that guy out of my head, because he went through things that none of us would do. We would all do what his wife did, curse God and die. Well,
Yep.
and I mean, I couldn't blame you for doing something like that if you felt like that. I mean, from a human feeling kind of deal, right? I know I've been there once or twice where I thought about it, and I don't say that with any pride. Oh
it's
man,
a low spot. That's
it
a pretty
is.
low spot.
It is.
Well, and it's that pursuit thing. This last Sunday I was teaching on Moses, and I like the story of Moses, studying the life of Moses, because the dude was jacked up. I mean, he started off on a bad foot. He's supposed to have been killed in Egypt, and they hit him because they weren't scared of the king. But then he has to grow up in somebody else's house, and so he's growing up, and he was old enough, to know, because he stayed with his mom and dad for a while, and then so he got moved around. But the dude had a temper problem like crazy. Moses lost his temper all the stinking time, right up till the very end. Almost.
I never even thought about that.
You just read through his stories in Genesis, Exodus, Exodus, in Numbers and Deuteronomy. You see a lot of stories about him where he's always blaming everybody else. You just see him. This is all your fault. It sounds just like Adam. It's the woman you gave me, Lord. I don't know. It's just her fault. But he's getting mad, and he's shaking his hand. And he's at one point in time he's like, "It's your fault that I don't get to go in. You blah blah blah." Well, the reason he didn't get to go to the promised land is he struck the rock twice instead of speaking to it that second time.
Yeah.
And but he always had this constant thread throughout all of that, up and down and rebellion and not doing right, of show me your glory. Show me your face. Who are you? And he's one of the two guys that gets to show up at the Mount of Transfiguration. Elijah being the other one.
That's very powerful.
Because Moses, there's a story about Michael the archangel contending with, was he contending with the devil or just
No, he was contending with Satan
over the body of Moses.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting story, but suffice it to say, Moses never got to go to the promised land. He never got the promise.
Yeah.
So he was under consequence of his action until he died. Okay? He was just, even while he pursued God, he was screwing it up and had problems. But he was what we call kept.
Yes.
And we know he was kept by the Lord because the dude shows up at the Mount of Transfiguration in white garments, and he's chatting with Jesus. Okay? Standing next to an incarnate Elijah.
Yeah, and even so, we're talking about these stories, right? And we're talking about the peoples, what we're doing. So you have to kind of analyze the people a little bit. And at least for me in my studies, I have to look at those guys as wherever they are in their walk. When you matured, you become more knowledgeable or more capable or whatever that is. And we all want to have all that in the end. Don't look at it like that. You got to look at these guys from where they started and where they came from. So Elijah, I mean, in terms of spiritual stuff, that was a man's man, right? And all the things that we think that we would do if we were real spiritual, he's out mocking and laughing at all the prophets that are doing their messed up church thing. And doing things that we would today can seriously condemn. He's like laughing at them, saying, well, maybe you ought to jump around more. Why don't you start cutting yourselves? You get a little blood on there, Yeah. And he's making fun of them. Yeah. I mean, just out and out the stuff that we'd be in the background going, yeah, that's the way you ought to do it. And the other crowd would be going, oh, you shouldn't do it like that. Forget all that stuff. But this is what Elijah's doing, right? I mean, you talk about a magnificent showing of God and all that stuff where he should have been up, doing the...
Mm-hmm. I mean,
One mad woman.
like a chapter later.
One mad woman got up, and she was not interested in any of that, and said, "I'm going to have your head." And he believed her.
Yep.
After all of that.
And the story reads that he went out and he was in despair. Like, I want to die. Despair.
Ran.
Yeah. Yeah.
From one
Yeah.
irritated, wicked, evil individual, he lost everything that he thought he knew about the kingdom. And it was right. He wasn't wrong. And that's what we run into when you take your I think he probably got all jazzed up for the fact that God was doing all this stuff that he knew he was going to do. And he thought he was doing it. And then what was her name? Jezebel?
Yeah.
Evidently he had seen what she could do.
Yeah.
And everybody backed up when Jezebel said something. So he's looking at it from that, I started to say earthly. I don't know, some church words, the physical,
Temporal.
I don't want to get into those terminologies because we start splitting those hairs, like you said, they're not split.
Yeah.
So where he's seeing the kingdom and the magnificence of God, how he moves, and it's not, that wasn't magical. He knew that God was going to do that.
Yeah.
He could see it. It was in tune with him. And then all of a sudden it all went away because he let the lie of the evil overtake him. But that had nothing to, God didn't even measure that. He let Elijah run and be all stressed out and wore out and all that, and he sent some folks to help him, to care for him. He covered and cared for him, but he used that to be able to strengthen Elijah. Anyway, you see that scenario take place, and you can see yourself in those situations going, yeah, I lose it all the time. Yet he's a guy that showed up at the transfiguration too. Yeah. So if that guy's going to go through the ups and downs, I'm surprised that Job didn't show up there, to be honest with you. But that doesn't mean that he wasn't. He was in the kingdom too. Well, yeah, and I think that for me, and we'll land the plane, the drive home is simply everywhere I turn in the scriptures, everywhere, I see another version of somebody coming to understand some of the kingdom and then reverting back to pursuing the mountain instead of the mover. Yeah. It's easy to do. It's really easy. Peter did it when he walked on water. It's another version of it. When he was focusing on the kingdom, the dude walked on water like Jesus. And when he started focusing on something else, he started sinking. And it's not, maybe we'll talk about practical and try to make that into, if you keep your eyes on Jesus, you'll never sink. And they want to make these really strange psychological applications of it. But the spiritual implication is, and to me in that is like, he just wants us to know him. He wants us to keep our literal, physical, spiritual, emotional eyes on him so that whatever's going on around us does not overwhelm us and we forget that they're all intertwined. Because you're going to get that phone call one of these days. Everybody's going to get it. Or somebody you love is sick, hurt, dead, gone, whatever. You're going to get it if you live long enough. The older I get, the more I was looking at our local school had honored the very first graduating class of Martin's Mill when they got their high school back, like in '84 or something. And there were several members of that they were gone. They're not here anymore. And you can get to where that's all you see. Or all you see is, I'm not able to move the mountain, therefore God must not love me, therefore I'm not in. Oh, yeah, that's where probably 99% of us, at least in the Christian world, keep ourselves. I do it too, all the time. But the answer to that is not try harder to move the mountain. Yeah. That's what we think. We got to try harder. We got to get the right program. Our discipleship at our church is terrible. Well, we got to get a better program. Or our children's stuff is terrible. We got to get another program. No.
we need to learn about who God is. And we need to, and that's at the end of all of these stories of these people, and we're going to go through some of them over the next few weeks. At the end of the stories on the successful ones, you see where they, even in their writings, you can see it in the writings of Peter. At the end of it, or the stories of Peter at the beginning of his walk, and then the writings of Peter there at the end.
Yeah.
Just a different guy.
Yeah.
You don't hear as much about here's what we got to do, here's the plan, here's what we're going to accomplish, and you start hearing more about the character and the nature of God and who He is.
Yes.
And it's a progressive thing, and it may take you your stinking entire life to figure it out. As a matter of fact, I think it will, and that's part of the hope of when He comes back. And it says we'll see Him as He is, and we'll know Him as He is because we do see in part. We see through a mirror darkly. We can't see the whole thing as He's revealing it. But one of these days, we're going to figure all that out because He's going to show it to us.
Yeah.
And there will be no more ambiguity. But even between now and then, there's so much of Him to be learned. My encouragement would be just stop trying to move the mountain. And whatever, I don't want to be cheesy, but whatever that mountain is you're trying to move, whether it's perfect church or whether it's...
Well, and sometimes you don't know what it is. I mean, it's not even just doing the church thing. It's just walking every day and doing what you're doing.
Well, and the pursuit of being a good Christian, I mean, do we pursue holiness and righteousness? Yeah. Do we want to pursue all those things? Yes. But I want people watching to start thinking about, but why are you doing it? Are you doing it so you can move a mountain, or are you doing it to know the guy that can? And when you get that figured out, that pursuit of holiness and righteousness takes on a new character.
Yeah.
Instead of just doing it to be done and check off your boxes, it's a means to an end, and the end is to know who He is.
Yeah.
And then you start living out of response, not out of pursuit of perfection.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a whole different deal.
Yeah.
Today's our 100th episode. If you comment, I'll put you in a drawing for some free merchandise. We would never, it's a shameless plug to get algorithm bumps. I ain't gonna lie, but share. I'll tell you what, if you share the podcast and go to our website and sign up and like us, I'll add your name more times. How about that? Shameless. But 100 episodes, that's a lot of them, man.
That's a lot.
And that's like 2 years worth, almost.
Yeah, I need a raise.
I'll double your salary tomorrow. Infinitely exponential. 0 to any power is pretty affordable. Guys, we love you. We care for you. We appreciate you. Don't forget to go out to your favorite app store, download the app, pray about if you ever think about. Oh, I got to have an announcement. March Madness is coming up next month. March Madness Bible giveaway. This is our 4th or 5th year to do it. I can't remember. Last year we handed out right shy of 2,000 Bibles in the month of March, and handed them out. We funded them. This year we've got a new partnership. I don't think I've told you about this. There's some folks at our church, Jeremy and Eve Co. They have a ministry called Real Vita TV, and it's a podcast, but it's on tablets that go into the prison system all over the country. Yeah. Literally hundreds of thousands of people watch their podcast because they're on those tablets, but those people that see it primarily are incarcerated, and many of them in the segregated units where they don't get to go out and go to church, and so it's a deal. But they take Bibles, and they actually have a ministry. They physically go into area prisons. I mean, they have people all over the country ask them to come in, but they take Bibles with them. And so we're partnering with Real Vita TV this year, and we want to really pack them up well. So I'm going to start sharpening that up between now. And if you wanted to give to that particular campaign, probably tomorrow there'll be a link on our website. If you go to I think I've got a deal on here. If you go to thecruciblesfire.org/donate, there'll be an option for March Madness Bible giveaway for 2024, and that'll be designated funds. It will go 100% of those funds will go to the purchase of and funding of Bibles for Real Vita TV in the prison units around the country. So there's a great need, and they get literally thousands of emails and letters a week from people who've given their heart to Christ and who are starting Bible studies. And the church inside of the prisons is growing. When watching their story, it's unbelievable. It's really kind of interesting. Anyway, that's coming. Download the app. Follow us on all the stuff. You got anything else?
That's all I got.
I'm hungry. It's time to go to lunch. I'm thank y'all if y'all were spending your lunch hour with us, but I'm going to go eat. We'll talk to y'all later. We appreciate you. And I can't think of anything else that we need to say. Can you?
See you
Bye,
later.
guys.